I'm going to call the Honourable Member Dr. David Clark.
Mr. Chair, thank you. I have waited a long time to
I know, I've been watching the debate.
And I'm very, very pleased to finally have my say, although I remain disappointed that many of the issues that I feel are germane to this debate have not been discussed, because the government has been so keen to rush this through without a full scrutiny of the Parliament, without a full debate, because they don't like it and they know that people out there in the street are marching against this. Mr. Brownlee knows that they're marching against this in the street. So they were marching in Dunedin, Mr. Brownlee. Mr. Brownlee, they were marching in Dunedin. They were marching elsewhere around the country. People, Mr. Woodhouse wasn't there. He was invited, but he didn't turn up. People hate this. They do not like this legislation, and that's why I particularly want to support Mr. Robertson's amendment, which calls for this to go back to the Select Committee, because the process was rushed there too. The process in the Select Committee was rushed, Mr. Chair. The people who spoke were limited to 5 minutes. The people around the table asking the questions on behalf of the Parliament were frequently limited to one question. No, I'm not joking at all. This is a very serious matter. This is not proper democracy. Mr. Little is right. This feels wrong. This is one of the most controversial pieces of legislation to go through this House, and I fear it has not had a proper Select Committee process, and that's why Mr. Robertson's amendment makes a lot of sense. It should go back, this bill should go back to the Select Committee to make sure that it has a full and thorough process. I know, Mr. Chair, that there were submitters who were not heard because they could not make teleconferences arranged at short notice. So we know, those of us who sat round the table and heard 150-odd submissions, know there were more who wanted to speak against this. Some of them may have wanted to speak in favour. We don't know. There were 0.6% of the submissions that were written submissions that were in favour of the bill. There may have been some germane ideas amongst those. Goodness knows the National Party could do with one or two arguments in support of its bill. But we didn't hear them, Mr. Chair, and nor did we hear from those many people who submitted but could not make the teleconferences that were arranged at short notice. Mr. Robertson's amendment is one well worth supporting. Mr. Chair, in the Treasury, there used to hang a cartoon on the top floor, and it was a cartoon by Tom Scott. I'm not sure if it's still there, but it's germane to the amendment I wish to move about privatisation, renaming the bill. And on this cartoon, this Tom Scott cartoon, stand two Treasury officials, obviously furious with one another. And this sits up, I'm sure, on the top floor of the Treasury as a reminder not to be stuck in those ideological blinkers, but to take the pragmatic solutions through the way forward through to the future. And the Treasury officials in this cartoon are arguing. They're arguing about the ECNZ split up. This goes a long way back. And one Treasury official says to the other, "I know it works in practice, but it doesn't work in theory," Mr. Chair. And the Treasury, I think, has learned from that. The Treasury now provides advice that says we should take the wider picture into account. We shouldn't have our ideological blinkers on, our privatisation blinkers. We need to take the facts into account. And that is why the Treasury has provided advice, Mr. Chair, that shows that there are lost dividends that are greater than the proceeds from these sales. That these sales, these privatisation sales, will take the country backwards. The government will be out of pocket as a result of these sales. And so, Mr. Chair, with Brian Fallow, who sees this legislation as a solution in search of a problem, I think that this bill should be renamed the State Asset Privatisation Bill. And that is why I've moved an amendment in my name to be very clear about what this bill is doing. We heard from a submitter, Mr. Chair, at the Select Committee, one of the ones who was allowed to speak, although he was kept pretty brief and within the constraints, the unreasonable constraints placed by the Chair of the Select Committee. He gave an explanation of what had happened in one of the regions in India, where a partial privatisation had proceeded, and then at a given point when the region was cash-strapped, the private investors came forward and said, "We will invest further in this company, but only if and only if the whole thing is privatised." That's the slippery slope, Mr. Chair, and that's the position that this bill puts us in. It puts us in a position where we are forced to work out whether the government is in a... Mr. Chair.
Yes, I will give the member another
Thank you,
call. I
Mr.
call the
Chair.
honourable member
And so,
David Clark.
we go down the slope, Mr. Chair, where the people who are in charge of these companies, we're told, will still be the government at 51%, but they're suddenly in a very vulnerable position for any future capital raising. They're also tied into raising any debt that's required to fund future capital developments. This legislation puts the government on the back foot. And why would we do that, Mr. Chair? These companies currently provide dividends that fund our schools and hospitals, and we are talking about privatising them so we can fund schools and hospitals overseas. We already own these assets. Why on earth would we want to sell them to other people, those who've got the money, who have benefited from the National Party's tax cuts only, and then allow them to sell them offshore so that those dividends flow offshore, so that they undermine our balance of payments yet further and get us into more of a hole than we're already in? Mr. Chair, it does not make sense. Private interests will control these assets in a way that they should not. Energy infrastructure is essential to this country. It's essential to our industries who rely on electricity for manufacturing. It's essential to our people down in the south, certainly, who are at risk of freezing in their homes if there's blackouts. And Mr. Chair, we need to control these assets because that's the role of the state. The role of the state is to look after its people, and we're afraid in the Labor Party that the appropriate measures are not contained in this bill to make sure that the appropriate Crown control is retained, so that these assets can be properly managed in the interests of the whole of New Zealand, not in the interests of the bottom line of a minority at this stage of private shareholders, Mr. Chair. So I'm arguing vehemently that the name of this bill should be changed to the State Asset Privatisation Bill, Mr. Chair, because that is what it is. Anything else is a mealy-mouthed attempt to divert away from the real issues here. The mixed ownership model, as it's being called, is not a popular vernacular term. It's not a term that everyday mum and dad New Zealanders understand, if there is such a mythical beast. So it should have this name, and then it should be sent back to select committee. As I began at the beginning of my speech to say, Mr. Robertson's amendment is one that I will be thoroughly and fully supporting, because it would see these issues debated fully and properly, not in a rushed process that replies back to the House 5 weeks ahead of schedule, Mr. Chair. 5 full weeks ahead of schedule for one of the most controversial pieces of legislation likely to go through. This was a rushed process. Teleconference submitters missed out. We had 5-minute limits on the submitters, and it reported back 5 weeks early. There was no need for that rush. There were plenty of questions that were not answered in Select Committee, and these are the kinds of questions that we could ask for further advice on. We could ask for further advice on the risks in the Tūwharetoa case. We could ask for further advice from the Treasury on what would happen in the management of Manapuri Dam, where we understand that there may be an increased cost to the Crown of doing business as a result of these changes. But we didn't get the opportunity to ask advice from officials because the Chair was in such a hurry to bring these issues, Mr. Todd McClay, back to the House. Now, I'd be interested if Mr. Todd McClay wished to take a call on this title and commencement clause, but we haven't heard anything from him. He's been keeping his head down since doing his part of this dirty deal and bringing this bill back to the House in short order, because he doesn't want the debate to flourish. He doesn't want the debate to be held fully in this House, and nor does the Minister. I challenge the Minister also to take a call on this part of the bill, to argue as to why it should not be called the Privatisation Bill, and to argue also why it should not go back to the Select Committee for a proper and full hearing, Mr. Ryle. Mr. Ryle, I think you understand the processes of this House. You've been around long enough, and I would like to see, Mr. Chair, it go back to Select Committee as Mr. Robertson recommends in his amendment. Other issues that could be debated in Select Committee and upon which we could seek advice are the discount rate choice done in the modelling. The replacement costs of these assets, could they actually be replaced? These were questions we didn't have advice on, Mr. Chair, and we know that those are difficult questions. We know the government doesn't want to face those questions, but it can and it should. It has advisers for a reason. We have a Select Committee process so that we can argue fully these issues and understand them fully, so the public can fully understand them, and so this House can reach proper and good decisions. When the process is rushed, the House is at risk of not making the best decisions on behalf of the country. And that's what we're here for. We're charged as parliamentarians to have this debate fully and properly. As the opposition, we know we're not always going to win the debate, but we actually want to make sure that the debate... Mr. Chair.
I call the honourable member Dr. Russell Norman.
Thank you, Mr.